A people lost in the swamp of drugs, the silent cry of the Uyghurs. An excerpt from the book East Turkistan, a genocide buried in silence. Author, Mehmet Emin Hazret. Global footprints of drug trafficking in Chinese prisons. As of 2017, 146 Colombian drug traffickers were imprisoned in Chinese jails, either awaiting trial or already convicted. Among them, 15 had been sentenced to death, while another 15 were serving life sentences. These individuals were hired couriers from Colombia, 17,000 kilometers away, who were caught at Chinese airports. According to a 2016 United Nations report, the volume of drugs seized in the Asia-Pacific region centered around China has tripled over the last decade. Citizens of Myanmar, Vietnam, the Philippines, South Korea, and Japan have also received long prison sentences, or the death penalty, for drug trafficking in China. But within this global landscape, those who have paid the highest price, ironically, have been China's own citizens, particularly the Uyghurs. 2. How did drugs penetrate Uyghur society? In the 1980s, as China liberalized trade, Uyghur merchants became pioneers in the country's major cities. Heirs to the Silk Road tradition, known for their courage, intuition, and business acumen, the Uyghurs opened the first wholesale markets, launched retail shops, established hotels and restaurants, and quickly outpaced the Han Chinese in mastering trade in China's urban centers. They played a dominant role in the black market trade along the Hong Kong-Guangzhou route. From 1980 to 1985, Uyghurs were the primary movers of smuggled electronics, textiles, and clothing. However, their rise was short-lived. By 1985, wealthy Uyghur businessmen, often seen in luxury cars, had become prime targets for both the Chinese mafia and state security forces. Their assets were seized, they were beaten, imprisoned, and systematically dismantled. Thousands of Uyghur entrepreneurs were wiped out. And in the void left behind, a new disaster emerged. Drugs. In the streets of Urumqi, Uyghur youth, even children, soon became addicts. It was the silent witness of a people's systematic collapse. 3. A forgotten ethnicity in the shadow of AIDS, the anatomy of a silent death. The first recorded case of AIDS in East Turkistan occurred in Urumqi in 1995. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg. Drug mafias, cooperating with actors from various ethnic groups across China, increased distribution in Uyghur neighborhoods. Dongans, Chinese-speaking Hui Muslims, were used as intermediaries. Uyghur clerics tried to warn the public from mosque pulpits. Intellectuals sounded the alarm through the press. But while one front resisted, the Chinese authorities launched a covert assault from another. State-sponsored collapse. Hundreds of establishments were set up under the guise of hotels, hair salons, massage parlors, physical therapy centers. But in reality, these places operated as brothels. Many of the Chinese women working there were AIDS carriers. These women were not only spreading sexual diseases, they were also suppliers of drugs. AIDS was no longer just a disease. It had become a silent weapon of biological genocide. 4. A generation lost in numbers. According to an official report published by the Chinese government in 2014, the number of registered AIDS patients in East Turkistan was 43,500. However, according to expert Uyghur doctors, the real figure was likely over 200,000. The virus was spreading rapidly, even among men and women who had never left their villages. A 2009 ethnic health report revealed, among every 100,000 Han Chinese, 56 were diagnosed with AIDS. Among Uyghurs, the rate was 335 per 100,000. Comparative figures. Kazakhstan, 74. Kyrgyzstan, 77. Uzbekistan, 58. Turkey, 5. Most of the patients in East Turkistan were between 18 and 45 years old. The most productive, strongest, and hopeful segment of society was being systematically destroyed. v. No treatment, no hope, only silence. Despite this alarming reality, there is no dedicated AIDS hospital for Uyghurs. No treatment or rehabilitation services are provided. No political priority is given to the region with the highest number of AIDS cases. Because in this case, the goal is not public health, but the silent extermination of an entire people. Sometimes the quietest screams echo the loudest. Silent graves, lost generations, the Uyghurs trapped in Ruyli's drug grip. The invisible war, Uyghurs and the synthetic drug trap. Behind the ongoing nightmare of drug addiction and AIDS in Uyghur communities lies a reality even darker than it appears. After the 2000s, as China's chemical industry shifted towards synthetic drug production, Uyghurs became the primary group used for testing and distribution of these substances. The individuals used as guinea pigs were often orphaned children, widows, members of impoverished families. In R&AMP Winking and Laughing Smiley laboratories located deep in China's interior, Uyghur children and women were subjected to experiments. A shameful stain on human dignity. At the same time, these individuals were used by Chinese mafias to transport and sell synthetic drugs. They had only two options: become addicts or become couriers. 2. Ruyli, the Uyghurs' quiet apocalypse. Ruyli is a small town in China's Yunnan province, near the border with Myanmar, one of the world's largest drug producers. And Ruyli is the gateway for that dark trade into China. In 2009, I published an article titled, "The Growing Uyghur Cemetery in Ruyli," a piece that caused major public reaction in East Turkistan. That article was based directly on the testimonies of Uyghurs living through the tragedy. At the time, approximately 3,000 Uyghurs were living in Ruyli. The town had essentially become an Uyghur ghetto, where residents were forced to work under the control of Chinese drug cartels. Around Kunming and the surrounding areas, it was estimated that 6,000 Uyghurs were involved in drug trafficking. This entire region had turned into a systematic graveyard of silence. Each week, 3 to 5 Uyghur funerals took place. Victims of overdoses. Those shot while trying to cross borders. Those who died in torture-filled Chinese prisons. They all ended up in the same place, Ruyli Cemetery. Some Uyghur youth, having earned short-term wealth, returned to their villages, gave money to their families, and even built mosques. Villagers saw them as benefactors. But in reality, they were setting off on their final journey, back to Ruyli, never to return again. 3. The poverty trap. How Uyghurs were pushed into the mafia. In East Turkistan, poverty, unemployment, lack of future prospects drove young Uyghurs into China's dark web of organized crime. The only doors China opened for Uyghurs led to drugs, smuggling, and mafia connections. All legitimate avenues of life were systematically closed off to them. 4. Double standards, free access to drugs, barred from life. Across many regions of China, Uyghurs were denied access to hotels, could not rent apartments, were banned from legal employment. But in Ruyli, every door was wide open for drug trade. According to Chinese law, anyone caught with 50 grams of drugs could face 15 years or more in prison. Yet in Ruyli, this law seemed suspended for Uyghurs. Because the aim was clear: pull more Uyghurs into this swamp, and then bury them quietly. V. The scale of the catastrophe in numbers. As of April 2009, the estimated number of Uyghurs directly involved in drug mafia networks across China was 25,000. These individuals were unable to participate in the legal economy, forced to become pawns in the machinery of the Chinese mafia. Conclusion: Ruyli Cemetery is the silent cry of a nation. Those buried in Ruyli were not just bodies. They were the hopes, the futures, and the honor of the Uyghur people. This tragedy was never reported in the media. It became neither a headline nor a documentary. It lived only in the prayers of those left behind. Ruyli Cemetery was the only stable institution China offered the Uyghur people. Even the dead were silent, but every one of them bore witness. Missing children, harvested organs, the end of humanity in China. Silent disappearances, Uyghur families erased. In the early 2000s, over 100,000 Uyghur Turks were imprisoned as political detainees in Chinese prisons. By the end of 2008, this number had exceeded 200,000. Each detainee left behind a spouse, a child, an entire family. As a result, around 100,000 widows, 150,000 to 200,000 vulnerable children were left to the streets. They not only lost their loved ones, they also lost every form of social security. Even giving someone a bowl of soup was considered supporting terrorism, and helpers were jailed. In this void of humanity, China's organ trafficking mafia stepped in. Every abandoned child and woman became a potential source of profit. 2. The dark web of human trafficking, drugs, and organ harvesting. Criminal networks representing China's darkest underbelly began paying petty criminals to collect orphan children. These children were taken deep into China's interior, erased from all records. Women and young girls were lured with promises of jobs, then sold into prostitution rings or drug cartels in Ruyli. At the same time, wealthy foreign patients began flocking to China for organ transplants. This system was legitimized under the label of medical tourism. At first, organs were harvested from death row inmates. But as demand increased, prisoners were no longer enough. The rest came from the bodies of orphaned Uyghur children and youth. And no one was left to ask about them. Fathers were already imprisoned, and mothers had long been stripped of the strength to resist. 3. A conscience cries out, the struggle of Dr. Ilham Tohti. One of the few brave voices who dared to speak out was Associate Professor Dr. Ilham Tohti from Minzu University in Beijing. Through the website he launched in 2006, Uyghurbees.com, he shed light on human trafficking, drug mafias, organ trafficking. He launched a campaign for Uyghur orphans, whose numbers were estimated at over 35,000. He called on Chinese and Uyghur volunteers. Don't let these children disappear. Let's find them, rescue them, and send them home to East Turkistan. This call touched the hearts of thousands. As a result, nearly 5,000 children were saved. But even this humanitarian effort proved intolerable for the Chinese state. Dr. Tohti was arrested and accused of separatism, attempting to divide the state. On September 23, 2014, in a closed trial in Urumqi, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Uyghurbees.com was shut down. The campaign came to an end. 4. And after that day, there was no one left to ask about those children. No voice was heard to rescue those women. The Chinese state did not just silence people. It silenced conscience, hope, and compassion. Even today, organ trafficking, prostitution networks, drug cartels continue to profit from the bodies and lives of the oppressed people of East Turkistan. Humanity's final test. What has taken place is not only a tragedy for one people. It is a dark period that tests the conscience of all humanity. The children disappeared. The organs were sold. The mothers were silenced. And the world watched. Synthetic poison. The Uyghurs in China's chemical grip. Drug haven or human lab. According to a 2016 report by the Chinese National Narcotics Control Commission, in that year alone, 102.5 tons of narcotics were seized. 77% of this total consisted of synthetic drug tablets manufactured in China. That same year, Reuters reported that the number of drug addicts in China had reached 14 million. These frightening figures point not only to a public health crisis, but also to a far darker system, one in which Uyghurs were used as test subjects at the center of a chemical disaster. 2. Poison under the shadow of science, the zombie drug. Zhong, a Chinese chemistry professor who had been conducting academic research in Australia, returned to China to establish a private chemical company. This company produced a new psychotropic substance called 3,4-methylanedeoxymethcathinone, known among the public as the zombie drug. Lethal in overdose, but legal in China. In a June 2015 investigation, the New York Times reported that between March and November 2014, Zhong had exported 193 kilograms of synthetic drugs, earned millions of dollars in profit. These substances, responsible for thousands of deaths across the US and Europe, had now become a threat even greater than heroin. 3. The poisoned root, Turkey and the Uyghurs. These deadly substances weren't only smuggled into Western countries. They were also trafficked into Turkey through illicit channels. Those arrested included Turkish citizens, Uyghur Turks, and Chinese traffickers. Some East Turkistani families sent their children to Turkey in hopes of freeing them from addiction. But tragically, some of these youths still could not escape the grip of drugs, and lost their lives there. Today, in the cemeteries of Istanbul, these young people lie as silent witnesses to the systematic collapse of East Turkistan. 4. Massive factories, performative raids. In major Chinese cities like Lebanon, Shenyang, and Nanjing, enormous chemical factories are known to produce these synthetic substances. Occasionally, state media publishes reports of police raids. But these raids are largely symbolic and for show. Left-pointing magnifying glass according to 2013 data from the US DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. 309 factories and workshops were shut down across China. Yet that same year, the industry website guidechem.com reported more than 150 facilities in China were still actively producing lethal substances such as APVP and flakka. In one small town in California alone, 18 people died within a short span of time due to these synthetic drugs. Kings of Poison and Uyghur Test Subjects. A synthetic drug marketed in Shanghai under the name Yarotuan, ecstasy pill, was being exported to 57 countries. The mastermind behind this operation was a mafia kingpin named ZHA with Macron Ng Lee. He was arrested in 2013 under pressure from the United States. But his factory? It continued operating. In fact, it even expanded its production capacity. This machine wasn't powered only by chemicals. It ran on the bodies of Uyghur youth. These synthetic drugs were tested on Uyghurs, sometimes under the guise of treatment, sometimes as a form of punishment. 6. A state-backed poison economy. This chemical industry is so deeply entangled with the Chinese Communist Party that a network of bribery keeps it functioning. Legal loopholes are deliberately ignored. Information flow is suppressed, making it nearly impossible to dismantle this system. And at the heart of this web, its most fragile and expendable link, are still the Uyghurs. The great stigma, the deafening silence, the isolated tragedy of the Uyghur people. From drug use to criminal branding, the individual destruction of the Uyghurs. China's chemical industry, its drug production networks, and the criminal syndicates that distribute these substances have used Uyghur Turks for years, not just as test subjects, but as targets of destruction. These networks did not stop at experimenting on Uyghur children. They turned them into couriers, pickpockets, thieves, and sex workers, and gradually labeled the Uyghur community as a criminal people. China's state and local media, through coordinated and continuous efforts, portrayed Uyghurs as crime-producing, dangerous, unwanted. Even Han Chinese who had never been to East Turkistan or met a Uyghur in person had this hatred injected into their minds deliberately, systematically, and ideologically. 2. The propaganda operation, a silent genocide, loud applause. This propaganda machine not only concealed the genocide of the Uyghurs, it also persuaded the Chinese public to approve of it, and even cheer it on. These policies are no longer carried out by the state alone. They now continue with the silent, and sometimes enthusiastic, approval of society. 3. Systematic silence, shameful isolation. The war of annihilation waged in East Turkestan is not just the product of the Chinese state. It is also the result of a coalition involving underground mafia networks, propaganda media, social media algorithms, and state-driven misinformation engines. They all work in unison, operating like a well-oiled destruction machine. 4. Why are the Uyghurs the target? Uyghurs are not targeted only because they are Muslim, or only because they are Turkic. They are also targeted because they are bearers of an ancient culture, symbols of resilient identity, a people who stand tall on their own land. For centuries, the Uyghurs have remained steadfast in their loyalty to Islam, in their devotion to their Turkic identity. But today, only the Republic of Turkey has shown partial support for them. Not the Islamic world. Not the Turkic world. Not the so-called global family of humanity. None have truly responded to the silent cry of the Uyghurs. V. Diplomatic silence, the political face of betrayal. In the halls of the United Nations, in international courts, on global human rights platforms, not a single nation has truly sought justice for the Uyghurs, the everyday Turk on the streets of Anatolia, a handful of conscientious intellectuals in the Arab world. Perhaps they still hear the cry, but their voices remain faint and sincere whispers echoing into forgotten mountains. 6. State terror, biological genocide through AIDS and drugs. The Chinese state wages war not only with weapons, but with humiliating, biopolitical tools like drugs and AIDS, aimed at breaking down an entire people, physically and spiritually. This is no longer a classic occupation, but a multi-layered genocide operated with a modern Nazi-like methodology. Today, Uyghurs are not only victims of invasion, they are targets of defamation, slander, exclusion. The Chinese state brands the Uyghurs as terrorist-linked, radical, ISIS sympathizers, effectively isolating them from the rest of the world. And yet, the Uyghur people's only crime is upholding their identity, faith, and dignity. 7. The shame of silence, the judgment of history. Before the eyes of the world, this slow, systematic, high-tech, multi-layered genocide has been unfolding for years. One day, it will face the judgment of history. But until that day comes, how many more generations will be lost? The Uyghurs are crushed not only by China's assault, but also by the world's silence and the indifference of those they once called allies. The Uyghurs are not just a people under attack. They are victims of a crime made possible by collective silence. 8. The dirty alliance between the drug economy and the security bureaucracy. China's synthetic drug production is not merely an economic activity. It is also a tool of social control and repression. This system operates through a covert alliance between the chemical industry and the security bureaucracy. The chemicals used in drug production are manufactured in state-run factories. The mafia-like organizations that produce and distribute them are deeply connected to local governments, law enforcement agencies, marginalized groups, especially Uyghurs, are deliberately chosen as subjects in the testing and distribution of synthetic drugs. This structure is designed to physically and mentally crush resistant populations, brand them as criminals to strip away public sympathy, and simultaneously generate massive economic profit. This is not your average narcotics network. It is a state-backed model of biopolitical control. 9. In the shadows of global pharma and chemical giants, there is growing concern that some synthetic substances produced in China are connected, albeit indirectly, to the supply chains of international pharmaceutical corporations. Clinical trial data, experimental findings, molecular composition samples may have been passed on to research centers tied to major multinational pharmaceutical companies. These connections are often hidden through university-sponsored projects, grants branded as medical innovation, indirect investments and subsidiaries. In this way, China's toxic chemical compounds are processed in some Western labs as research material, effectively bypassing ethical boundaries. The international distribution of these substances is facilitated through gray-area logistics systems that exploit gaps in legal frameworks. 9. Global spread of substances tested on Uyghurs. Synthetic substances that were tested on Uyghurs and later presented under the label of rehabilitation gradually spread beyond China's borders, reaching youth in Western metropolises, low-income regions across Central Asia, transit hubs like Turkey. Some of these drugs underwent their initial reaction testing in Chinese-controlled detention camps, specifically on Uyghur prisoners. The resulting data was modified at the molecular level, passed through legal gray zones, and then distributed globally via online marketplaces or fake laboratories. These substances are typically cheap, easily transportable, fast-acting but severely damaging, and with every single dose, not only is an individual made into an addict, but the remnants of a biological war waged against an entire people are also carried forward.